a series of science fiction noir novels is how I usually describe them, published by Orbit Books. So again, thanks very much for having me. One of the other things that I write is a little zine. It's a self-published magazine called Rain or Swine. And a couple of years ago, I wrote something that I'm going to read very quickly, which touches on writing and how I got started writing. So I'll start there. I trace my desire to write to a pair of head injuries I suffered as a child. No, no, really. The first was when I was very young, and my brother Sean, who's standing in the back there, who I'm about to insult rather egregiously. First was when I was very young, and my brother Sean and I were wrestling in the living room. Sean is 3 years older than me and possesses that weird sort of superhuman strength previously only found in Bruce Banner. Push Sean too far, and he's like Lennian of Mice and Men. He breaks things. That night, he broke me. He tossed me across the room like a sack of marbles, and I cracked my head against the chair and suffered a slight concussion. He's laughing, savoring the memory. The rest of the evening is a blur. I got my revenge later in the year by causing Sean to sit on a lead pencil in the hopes that he would acquire lead poisoning and die. Obviously, I failed, and currently I think I don't regret that. Such is the progress of my sibling relationship. A few years later, I suffered the second head trauma. In the city, during the summer, the temperatures often reach giddy levels of Salvador Dali-like hallucination, and the inhabitants have traditionally staved off mass death by opening up the fire hydrants and basking in the cool, bitter water. This usually means a few buildings have to burn to the ground due to the lack of available water, but it's better than melting alive, which is no way to die. At any rate, one summer, the superintendent of the apartment building across the way had opened up the hydrant to save the children's lives, and I went out to run amok in the water. I was having a great time until my second head trauma. All I remember is looking up in time to see this huge red-headed kid who must have weighed 600 pounds bearing down on me. The next few hours were just a blur. Another concussion, another hospital trip. It was never quite the same. I spent the next few months wandering the house in a bathrobe, feeling strangely disconnected and meaningless for a kid. I started smoking cigarettes, drinking heavily. I called a lot of 1-900 porn numbers. When school started again, I dealt some drugs and got into a lot of fistfights. I got that embarrassing Fred Flintstone tattoo on my ass that I'll never live down. All I can say is that it sounded good at 3 a.m. in Union City after a handful of breads and a six-pack and an evening dancing the samba music and betting heavily on the cockfights. And then one day, I just started writing. Since then, the only thing that has stayed constant in my life is writing. Through various rehabs, blackouts, hospital stays, prison stretches, relationships, and personalities, I've always written. And the one thing I can say for sure about this business of writing is, writers are all fucking crazy. So that's my fanciful way that I started writing. The truth is that when I was a little kid, I had an animated version of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe on television. And this was so far back that there were no VCRs even, at least not in my house. You know, perhaps in NASA they had VCRs back then, but we didn't. No DVRs, nothing ever got repeated. You'd watch a show and just in the memory hole forever. And I remember being forced to the library during school one day. You know, they used to take us bodily as a class and force us to go to the library with a stern warning that you had to take out a book that didn't have pictures and wasn't about sports. You couldn't just take out Reggie Jackson's biography every time you went. And I was walking around trying to find a book on magic tricks, and I looked up and there's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and it had never occurred to me before that it was source material. I thought they just made this stuff up for TV. And not only that, but there were sequels. There were 6 other books, and I was stunned. And I just started taking the books out one after the other. I take all 7 out for 2 weeks, bring them back, take them out again, bring them back and take them back. And that's what started me writing, because I was so angry that they ended, and I wanted more. And I started to think, well, I'll just make up my own, and that's where it really started. The head trauma story is a little bit more exciting, I think. This eventually led to my first book, which was Lifers, which you will not find anywhere. You will barely find any record of its existence. So I like to carry this around as a totem and say, yes, it did exist.
No, we have copies.
Well, yeah, that's true. I have like
There's
5,000
actually
copies.
there's actually reviews of it on Amazon.
That's true. That's true.
You can't go buy the book, but
and that's actually not even a science fiction book, and that was written 10 or 15 years ago. The Electric Church I actually wrote when I was very young. I was about 19 when I wrote the first draft of this novel, and then it sat in a drawer for about 20 years. And I kept pulling it out, and I would tinker with it. I liked the concept, I liked the idea of some of the characters, but it was a very immature novel, obviously. I'm not a genius I'm not born a genius, so my early novels were not the greatest in the world. But this had a lot of potential. Back in 2004, there was a website started called AnotherChapter.com, and their idea was they were going to send out serial fiction through email. So every week you would subscribe to a book, and every week you would get a new chapter. And ideally what they wanted was something more soap opera that would go on indefinitely, where you would just get a continuing adventure of a character or something. But they would accept stories that had definite endings as long as they went on at least novel length, and, at least in their parlance was 35 to 40 chapters or 35 to 40 weekly installments. So more as a challenge than anything else, I dusted this off and I took their guidelines and started to work on reworking the novel as a weekly experience. And that's where this version of the Electric Church was born. And they bought it they basically paid me magic beans for it because I never actually got paid anything. But happily, they went out of business very shortly after they bought the novel. The copy editor that they assigned to me was Lilith St. Crow. I don't know if you've ever heard of Lily. And she had just gotten a publishing contract with Warner Books. And she was my copy editor, and she loved the book, and she showed it to her editor there and said, "You should buy this." And she did. And then she moved to Orbit Books, and here we are today. So that's my little publishing story. What I thought I would do, I know you guys are discussing the first book, The Electric Church. This is the third book, The Eternal Prison, which is not out in mass market yet. It's coming out in mass market in a couple of months. So this is the trade version. I was going to read the prologue from this book, which I know may be a bit of a disconnect since you haven't, I'm not sure if you've even finished reading the first book yet. But I like this prologue, so I'm going to read it.
I actually requested
And I do whatever Danette says. Actually, this is technically this is chapter 1, not the prologue. It originally was the prologue, and then we added something before it, so that became the prologue. I'm sure. Now I'm rambling. All right. So this is chapter 1. It's entitled American Murder. Actually, before I start, does anybody want a 30-second summary of the universe of the Electric Church and all that? Sorry, I wasn't sure how much you had already read. The Electric Church is set in the future next Wednesday, very, very near future, after the world has been unified. All the nations of the world have been unified under one government, which was not a very peaceful or happy process. The world's economy has suffered tremendously from this disruption, and conditions around the world are not particularly good. There is a single unified police force, called the System Security Force. Sorry, I got distracted there. Single unified police force called the System Security Force, who are very brutal in enforcing the laws of the universe. The main character, Avery Cates, is an assassin. He's just a career criminal, and he's worked his way up to assassination for hire. He's not a particularly nice guy, I don't think. He's kind of funny, but he's not very nice. He's also, in the beginning of the Electric Church, he's not exactly world-renowned. He's not the greatest criminal in the universe. He's simply scraping by. The fastest-growing religion in this world is the Electric Church. And the Electric Church postulates that a normal human lifespan is not long enough for you to contemplate your sins. It's not long enough to gain salvation. It believes in a God. It believes in a higher power. But it says that 70, or in this universe, more like 40 or 50 years of a lifetime, you can't even begin to ask the right questions, much less come up with the answers. So immortality is the only way to go, and they achieve that through cyborg conversion, where they take your brain and put you into a cyborg body, where theoretically, being as you're powered by a nuclear fuel cell, you could go on until the universe ends, and that might be just enough time to decide whether you can get into paradise or not. And of course, there were all sorts of dark secrets and mysteries, and poor Avery Cates, who doesn't want to have anything to do with any of this, gets sucked into it, and just for his own survival has to figure everything out and solve all these mysteries. By the time we get to the third book, poor Avery is going to end up in prison, which might have been telegraphed by the title. But something very strange is going on in the beginning of this book, which I'm not going to get into because you'll have to find out for yourselves. And this is chapter 1, called American Murder. Las Vegas was a scrub of a town, an electric grid in the middle of the fucking desert, guarded by the burned-out husks of ancient hotels. You could walk through the inhabited town in 10 minutes and be in the extended graveyard that was the old city in